Hi everyone, it's Danny. Okay, so one of my viewers has asked me to make a video about how to care for mounted orchids. Now, I will give you my ideas and tips from the point of view of your average home grower. So, a person who does not benefit from a greenhouse and the moisture in a greenhouse and so on. Basically, if you want to keep mounted orchids in a home, in a balcony, so not in a greenhouse, here are my tips and ideas. Let's start off by saying that most of the epiphyte orchids we can easily find available can be grown mounted as well. There are a few exceptions, and I would like to mention the Miltoniopsis orchids and the Nellie Eiler and their hybrids and so on, simply because they require so much moisture that it will actually be a hassle to keep them healthy on a mount. Other than that, orchids like Vanda orchids, Orchidleas, Phalaenopsis, and even Oncidium orchids can actually be grown on mounts in a normal home. The major issue you will face with a mounted orchid will actually be watering. Since a mounted orchid is not in a pot and doesn't have that much media around its roots, your main concern is to keep it hydrated. A mounted orchid needs to be watered on a daily basis practically, especially if you're growing it in a home which does not have added humidity like the use of a humidifier and so on. So practically your major issue will be to water this orchid about every day or maybe 2 days, depending on your environment, temperature, light, and so on. In the summertime, I discovered that I actually needed to water my orchids, my mounted orchids, about twice a day because the temperatures were really high. Humidity was not that high either, so about 2 times a day I was okay if I watered my orchids. In the winter time, I'm practically good with once a day. A little tip to make your life somewhat easier is the use of sphagnum moss. As you can see, I have a bit of sphagnum moss here on the mount, and this actually keeps more moisture for longer periods of time to my orchid. It will definitely not go for a few days for me in my environment, but for 1 day it is practically perfect. Of course, the mount will retain a bit of moisture as well, but certainly not enough. So the use of sphagnum moss around the roots is actually beneficial if you're growing your mounted orchid in a home environment which does not benefit from high humidity. The way to water a mounted orchid, well, it's really up to you. If you want to spray the root system and the mount, then you can spray it. I simply dunk this orchid into the bucket where I water my Vandas as well, and that's good for me. However, I made sure that my Vanda orchids are not displaying any signs of disease, pests, and so on. And this orchid is actually the only one that gets watered in the same water with my Vanda orchids. Other than that, I never use the same water with all of my orchids, just because I had problems in the past with transmission of pests, diseases, and even viruses. Since a mounted orchid gets watered so often, it needs to be fertilized often as well, and it's pretty logical. If you water a pot with fertilized water, that water will be retained into the pot for a few days up to a week. So in this time, the orchid absorbs that water and nutrients, so practically you're offering a few days of fertilizer to this orchid. A mounted orchid, however, does not benefit from that. Every time you water, you're actually flushing out the salts. So most people fertilize mounted orchids at least once a week. And in the summertime, it can actually be fertilized even often, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Of course, there are people who use fertilizer with each watering on a weekly basis, but more appropriate to mounted orchids, they mix a little bit of fertilizer with each watering. And once a week, they flush it, they flush the salt built up, and everything is fine. So fertilizing is really up to you. What fits you, what fits your lifestyle, and so on. But just keep in mind that a mounted orchid will need more frequent fertilizer than a potted orchid. Regarding factors like light quantity, temperature, and so on, just try to provide whatever your orchid needs. If it's a Phalaenopsis orchid, it really doesn't need that much sun. If it's a Cattleya orchid, it will need much brighter light, so treat it just like a potted orchid in this instance. Now, the major benefit of actually mounting orchids is that you are less far prone to having root rot because the orchid is super airy most of the time. It actually resembles the way it should grow in nature. But mountain orchids is really not for everybody, and if you cannot provide watering this orchid at least once a day, especially in the summertime, and in some cases, if you cannot provide the relative humidity that your orchid needs, maybe mounted orchids are really not for you. Also, it really depends on the type of orchid you have mounted. If you have an Oncidium, that Oncidium will require a lot more water than what I have here, which is a Renanthera. If you have a Cattleya orchid, it will not require that much water. So I have an example of an orchid which used to be mounted, but I had to switch it up to a pot. Now this is an Oranges orchid. It is the type of orchid which does very good mounted, but under certain conditions, and I found with myself that I actually could not keep up with the rhythm of watering I had to provide for this one. It seems this Oranges tends to like a lot more water than the Renanthera here. So for this reason, and to keep it still hydrated, I had to move this orchid back into a pot. So mounted orchids is certainly something that you could try out. It's really interesting, and it certainly is more natural than potted orchids, but it really is not for everybody. Also, be careful what orchids you want to mount. If you want to start with something, I suggest you start with Camellia orchids. They are pretty forgiving to drought and forgetting to water. So alrighty, I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it useful. Mounted orchids for me are really not a solution. I just wanted to try it out, and a few orchids I think can be grown mounted in my environment and with my lifestyle, but I really doubt that any other of my orchids can be grown like that without me being too stressed about it and frustrated. And I prefer not to frustrate myself and in the process damage the orchid as well. So alrighty, if you want to see more videos, don't forget to subscribe. You can leave me your suggestions or questions regarding orchids in a comment below, and I will try to make a video for you. And I will see you next time. Bye!